If you're new or relatively new to reading the Bible, going to church, learning about the Bible, at first glance, let's say you bring it home, you crack it open for the first time, you start to read stories, you start to see a lot of miracles in the Bible. You see God opening up water, people walking through. You see God sending down fireballs and curses on people. There's miraculous deaths, miraculous people coming to life. There's axe heads floating. There's people surviving types of things, fire that they shouldn't survive. And then you hit the New Testament, and you start seeing Jesus walking around. And at first glance, you just read the Bible for the first time, you kind of see him just like, you're blind, healed. You're lame, healed. You're dead, back to life. All you got is water, wine. It's like you couldn't really be criticized for that because that seems to be what Jesus is doing. And a lot of Christians have come to that conclusion that Jesus is the great healer, that God is very interested in healing people, but it's just up to you and whether you have enough faith. Because all the healings Jesus does, he seems to be kind of waiting. You got faith, okay, here's the healing. Kind of like at the peony, you got the hammer. If you just hit it hard enough, you ring the bell, you get the prize. It seems to be, at first glance, what Jesus seems to be doing. You got faith, you get the prize. Healing for you. And a lot of Christians have come to that conclusion that God is super interested. One of his priorities is to heal you. It's like he's up there saying, hey, healing's for everybody. Blindness, sickness, cancer, malnutrition, whatever. If you just have enough faith, I'm going to heal you like Jesus did. And so a lot of Christians kind of think that way. But the problem with that is, as we're going to see, and hopefully I'll point out in the next 4 or 5 weeks, is that that's a distortion of who God is, that's a distortion of what God's priorities are, and that's a distortion of what sin and its consequences are. And the other problem with it is, if you have ever met someone who's lost faith or they're deconverted from Christianity, one of the main reasons that usually often happens is God didn't heal somebody. You know, you got a little kid, mom has cancer, they're praying and praying, like they're demonstrating that faith, that kind of desperate faith, and the mom dies. Or the older adults, grandparents are sick, and they're starting to suffer. The grandparents have been Christians their entire lives, the most faithful people that young person has ever seen, and they suffer and drift into Alzheimer's or some debilitating disease, suffer, and then they die, and they think, God, you're the great healer. You seem to prioritize healing. This person had the kind of faith we see in the Bible. This child had the kind of faith. This parent had the kind of faith for their child. Yet no healing. I don't think you're real. I don't believe in you anymore. If you are real, you totally let me down and I'm not in anymore. And if you're probably just not real, people just made it up, and Jesus didn't do those kind of healings because my situation seemed to fit the pattern and nothing happened. I remember in high school, a friend of mine was in a wheelchair. He had a disease where his muscles would get weaker and slowly atrophy. And I remember some Christians telling him, you know, the reason you can't walk is because you don't have enough faith. If you just had enough faith, God will allow you to walk. And at the time, I just thought that was a very cruel thing to say to somebody. But you can kind of see how they would come to that conclusion. They were just being super blunt about what some people think, which is God's a great healer. If you have enough faith, he would just love to heal you. But he is holding off, waiting for you to muster up enough faith, for you to believe enough, for you to be desperate enough. And it doesn't work. So I thought that was pretty cruel. And it reveals the distortion that many of us have about God, and many of us have about God's priorities, and many of us have about sin and its consequences. Because here's what our priorities are. Our priorities are that we're going to be relatively healthy our entire lives, that we're going to die maybe around 80 in our sleep. So it's painless. That's kind of our priorities. Health, painless death in our 80s, late 70s, or early 90s. And we also, one of our priorities is that we want to have enough money to get through life, maybe $80,000 a year. That seems to be an 80 number. Die at 80 in our sleep, $80,000 a year would be great. We'd like to have companionship or a relationship. We don't want to be single our whole lives. We want to be married, and that's a priority for us. And some kind of success whether it's fame or a job, or we're kind of reaching our goals, or we're satisfied with accomplishing something, all of us kind of prioritize those 4 things: health, money, relationships, and success. That's kind of our priority, and we think that those are also God's priorities. The problem is, as I read the Bible, and as we're going to see in the story we're going to look at, God seems to not have the same priorities as us. We would all agree that there's kind of a physical component to us. Those are our 4 priorities. And there's also a spiritual component to us. And those seem to be God's priorities. It would seem while we prioritize physical health, God seems to prioritize our spiritual health. While we tend to prioritize our financial riches, God seems to prioritize our spiritual riches. Whereas we seem to prioritize our relationships, usually physical, and young people growing up, like I was watching a movie, a teenage romance movie the other day. I won't tell you what it was because I don't really think it's that great. But you just kind of get a view into how young people think. And it's, if I would have gone to that movie land and say, hey, you guys should have a relationship without any physical contact. They're like, what are you talking about? I just met this girl tonight, and now we're holding hands and kissing, like within hours. Like, if there's not physical, there's no relationship. That just seems to be the way people think. Whereas God doesn't, that's just an extreme kind of way people think, how we value physical. We value relationships, concrete relationships, whereas God seems to value the spiritual part about relationships. We value success in business, or our family is successful, like my kids have grown up, they're polite, healthy, nice kids, getting jobs. Whereas God seems to prioritize spiritual success. That's kind of like Ghost in the Machine. Growing up, my favorite album was Police, Ghost in the Machine, songs like The Invisible Sun or Spirits in the Material World. It was actually my only album. It was also my favorite. We seem to prioritize the machine. We got to have some ghost. There has to be some spiritual element, because if we were 100% just physical things, we feel very lonely, very depressed. Even in that movie that I mentioned, or didn't mention, there's this 5-minute scene where the young man and the young woman start talking about Judaism and how God wants to put the pieces back together, and then the smart young man says, maybe we're the pieces. And then they go back to making up. So even in like movies that is all like concrete stuff, they have to put some spiritual in there, or it just seems like an empty movie, like the movies that came out in the 80s. Just like pure vacuous emptiness. So even today we're a little more spiritually tuned. We got to put some in there. So we value the machine, just a little bit of ghost, whereas God values the ghost, and the machine serves to make the ghost better. Put it another way, we value the external journey, God prioritizes the spiritual journey, and the external journey serves the spiritual journey. And if you think about it like that, the God of the Bible would seem to be the God who would say, I value your spiritual journey so much, the only way to bring health to your soul is to give you a physical sickness. The only way that I can bring health to your soul is to injure you, break your bones, whatever it takes physically. If I can make you more healthy spiritually, I'm fine with that. Whereas we'd say, hey God, I thought I prioritized healthy, die when I'm 30, in my sleep, money, relationships, everything. God says, we look at things different. I look at the spiritual far more than you do. You look at the physical far more than I do. We want lots of physical, a little bit of soul. God says, I want lots of soul, a little bit of physical. So into that's kind of the premise. We're going to look at that for the next 4 or 5 weeks. God's priorities are different than ours. If we have a distorted view of God and His priorities, we're going to have a distorted view of why God heals, how He heals, when He heals, how do we get Him to heal, and what His view on sickness is. Matthew chapter 8. We're going to spend the next 4 or 5 Sundays in Matthew chapter 8 and chapter 9, and we're going to see a lot differently, hopefully, than we've previously looked at these verses and these stories. Some of these stories are very familiar to those of us who've been in Bible study for a long time. Hopefully we're going to see something, because what Matthew does, you could have sound bites, politicians master the art of a creative, spicy soundbite.